Welcome back to today's episode of Words of the Wise. Today I have Chief Gonzalez from Capital Region Airport Authority in Michigan. He has 29 years experience in law enforcement. Welcome to the show, Chief Gonzalez. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really looking forward to today's group conversation.
Me too. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. So, I first want to have a little bit of background on you because 29 years is not a short amount of time. It's a long time to be in this profession. What was your upbringing like? Why did you choose law enforcement? And give us a little bit of background into your career.
Well, I was the kid that always knew he was going to go into law enforcement, the military, the fire service, something to that effect. And as I grew up, went through high school, college, I settled on law enforcement. Ended up working for an agency where close to where I started my college education at. I worked for 24 years with the East Lansing Police Department in Michigan, and about 5 years ago, threw my name in the hat for the chief's position here at the airport, and was fortunate enough to get it, and here I am. So I've had a pretty wide breadth of experience with patrol, investigations, police administration. I left the city of East Lansing as a deputy chief, and so I've seen had the opportunity to work in all facets of the agencies.
Yeah, nice. I'm always so envious of people who have always known what they want to do because I was not that way at all growing up. I felt so lost, but I have um, I guess she's my half sister, but she is like two. So we didn't grow up together. My dad had a child really late in life, and I was just over there for Easter, and her whole toy box is filled with fire trucks and police cars, and she is just playing with them. And I keep looking at my dad because my dad had a rough past, and he spent time in the prison system, and I look at him and I'm like, she is not your kid. Like she falls far from the tree, which is a good thing. And every time we go by a fire truck or an ambulance, she goes, wee you, and she's like so excited. And we're like, that kid is going to be a first responder. Like we just know it.
Yep.
So, and she wanted to dress up like a nurse. She's two and, or no, it
Oh,
was a doctor. And she's 2 years old, so we're thinking that she might be one of you guys someday.
yeah, that's great. That's inner fabric. And I've got two boys, 17 and 20 years old. And my youngest was just like me. He's known what he's wanted to do. He's headed towards the military and then a career in law enforcement. He's known that since he was 3 years old. And my oldest is headed towards a career in law enforcement as well. But it took him a while to get there. He floated around with different ideas and finally settled on this career. So it's so interesting to see the difference between the two and how they develop, but kind of end up on the same path. Yeah,
Do you feel like having two kids who ultimately want to be in the same or similar profession as you, do you think that that's given you a different perspective as a leader with, how proactive you are with wellness and, creating a culture that's supportive because they're entering into it?
absolutely. One of the things that I've really started to have conversations with them with, it centers around mental health because I certainly have had my own journey with mental health. And when I started back in 1997, it wasn't a topic, and it wasn't even 5 years ago. It really wasn't a topic of conversation amongst your colleagues. And so hopefully the tide is slowly starting to turn in the career field. And I think, especially when you have kids that are at that age, that 17-year-old, early 20s, having those conversations be natural in the home setting will
Mhm.
then translate to the work setting as well. And it will be natural for them to um, just look after their mental health, even early on in their career. It's just like your physical well-being. You eat right, you work out, you take care of your brain as well. So
Yeah, I love that you said that if it can be a normal conversation. And I've talked about this before, but I don't know. I don't remember my family talking to me about this. I don't know really where I learned this, but ever since I was an adult, I went to the doctor and I got blood work every year.
Hmm.
I went to the dentist twice a year. It was always something that I did to just be proactive and just make sure that everything looks good and, no cavities and blood work looks good and all the things. And as I've developed in this career, I've started to realize that that's not really a normal thing for a lot of people. It's scary to go do those things, or, people are afraid to find out, or to know what they didn't know before. And
Right.
so to have those early conversations, create those early habits, maybe it's something that can prevent a lot of things from happening in the future. That's the idea, is to reduce the risk of these big things happening moving forward. And so I love that you said having it as a normal conversation at home and as early in their career as possible so we can start developing those habits early.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very important.
What do you think is the biggest challenge when it comes to law enforcement wellness as a whole?
Well, I think, there it's twofold. On the physical side, when we talk about, someone's physical wellness, nutrition can be a very big barrier, simply because of the type of work that we do. Shift work, whether you're working a day shift, night shift, or something in between, certainly throws a wrench in the works of your nutrition, and it takes some planning and perseverance to make sure that you're eating well. The other thing too, though, is when we throw in shift work and we've got, you might be working a graveyard shift and then you turn around and you go to court and
Mm.
then maybe you get 2 or 3 hours of sleep in the middle of the day. You turn around, you've got your kids to take care of right after school, and then you're back at work. That sleep deprivation, as we all know, just builds up. You can't bank sleep, so to speak. And so that builds up over time. And when you're 21, 22 years old, just starting out in this career, it's easy to kind of handle and absorb that stress on your body. But as you get older, it just builds and it causes, all sorts of physical problems. And then on the mental health side, of course, there was that, stigma that has existed for years of we don't talk about it, we can absorb it, we can take care of this, we're supposed to be tough. Um, but we all know that that's not true. And so it's heartening to see agencies start offering different programs more than just an EAP program, where they're either introducing their young recruits to mental health care in some way, or even some agencies that are mandating every year you go get a checkup, just like you said, you get your blood work done, you go to the dentist. Every year, you're going to go get a checkup for your mental health and just touch base with somebody to make sure that you're on track and make sure that you're processing some of the things that you see, some of the stressors that you experience throughout this job.
Yeah, I appreciate that you talked about the realities of the career, because there's certain things that you might not be able to control, but then there are things that you can control. You might not be able to control the fact that you just worked a grave and now you have to go to court and now you got to go play with your kids. But there are things that we can help to control. Nutrition does play a role in sleep and sleep quality. There are other resources and sleep hygiene practices that we can implement to at least try to extend the quality of sleep that you get. So if you only have 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, whatever that looks like, can we make sure that those are really quality hours of sleep instead of you tossing and turning and thinking about a bunch of stuff and not being able to sleep throughout the limited time that you have. But then I also appreciate that you did talk about the reality outside with the kids and the family, and it's a lot to juggle. So, how can we be more proactive? And, obviously, like you said, organizations are starting to take this approach of how can we be more proactive. But I also would encourage the individuals to understand that ultimately it's up to you. You also have to take action in your own life. And I think right now we're struggling with that intrinsic motivator, or creating the consistency and the dedication for people to take action. You said nutrition and meal prepping, and I'm like, yeah, that would be great. How do we get people to do it? What do
Yeah,
you think is the secret sauce to getting people, to want to take care of themselves?
well, I think, again, it comes back to that struggle of when you're young, um, you feel almost invincible. And especially with this career, there's things that will pop up 15, 20 years later, or even 30 years later, that all of a sudden are causing you some type of, whether it's a traumatic scene that you were on, or just the chronic stress of the job. 5 years in, it was okay, but 10 or 15 years in, it's really starting to take its toll on you. And so, fortunately, when I was with my previous agency, we had 1 week in service training periods. And the chief at the time would bring in nutritionists and give people those resources of, okay, this is how we meal prep. This is the actual impact that sugar can do to your physical health, those types of things. And the chief even at one point in time had an optometrist come in
Mm.
just to talk about, things that you don't really think about, could impact your physical well-being down the road. And so, um, I think it's the most important piece is just looking outside the box and bringing those resources into the agency to make them as accessible as possible for officers, and thinking about things that we don't normally talk about. We just take it for granted. And the next thing you're 15 years into your career and you've survived on fast food and shift work and everything else that goes along with the job. And these physical problems start to crop up as you get a little bit older. So,
Yeah, I think that education and awareness is really important. At the very least, someone can't say I didn't know.
right,
At least they know. But you're right, your body and your mind are a reflection of your habits, and you do not, I tell everybody this, and it's a reality, and we have to be honest with ourselves. You do not become overweight overnight.
that's true. Yeah,
It's daily habits over a period of time where you start to see that happen. Um, a lot of the chronic pain and the injuries that we're seeing, also, it's not overnight. Probably, let's put in a really simple example. Someone pulls their hamstring and they're like, oh, now I have an injury. Well, your hamstrings were probably really tight for a really long time and they couldn't move. And now was the time where you injured yourself. It was daily habits over time of sitting and not focusing on flexibility that led us to where we are today. And so I think that when we have these conversations with the young people who do feel invincible, and I've had this before, this is probably maybe like 6 months ago. I was in a briefing and I had a young kid kind of like laughing in the back, kind of making jokes with this friend. And I was like, hey, like, what's up? And he's like, oh, nothing. I'm really young. I don't have to worry about this stuff yet. And I
yeah,
was like, yet. Yeah. And I'm like, exactly. That's why we got to start now, because you don't want to get there. And I think it's really important for people. And honestly, this is the reason why I had started this podcast in the first place, is because I was always having conversations with leadership and I was always hearing them say these I wish statements. It was always I wish I would have prioritized my wellness earlier and maybe my back wouldn't be so jacked up. Maybe I wouldn't have 3 shoulder surgeries. Maybe I wouldn't have 3 divorces. Maybe it was always these like maybe things would have turned out differently if I would have done this when I was younger, or if I would have known these things when I was younger. And now the younger generation can't blame it on not knowing because it's a part of the conversation,
right.
but it's the inaction. And so, how do we get I'm going to put this in quotes, but how do we get the older generation to share those things? How can we get everyone to feel comfortable enough to say, hey, man, like I didn't do these things and here's what happened? And
Yeah, hindsight is of course always 2020, and as you get into your career and you're towards the end of it, all of those things are glaringly obvious to us. And sometimes we can express it to the younger generation as much as possible by sharing our thoughts or giving those I wish stories. But really, I think it's incumbent upon leadership to find mechanisms to almost, I don't want to say force it on the younger generation, but almost make it, too easy not to take advantage of. So, some of the things that we've seen, especially in ergonomics in law enforcement lately, is, just about everybody has gone to outer carrier vests. And, some of the younger officers may say, yeah, they look cool and, I can reach all of my equipment very easily on my vest. But, what I found is, uh, while there's practicality in just doing the job with it, but what it does is it gets all that weight up off your hips and spread out across your shoulders and your chest and back. And so hopefully over time, it would be great to see in 20, 25 years if the number of hip injuries, knee injuries, lower back problems that officers are having has been reduced by that. The other thing that I think is probably an unintended consequence is most agencies have gone to an SUV type vehicle. When I started, and for years we ran, sedans. We were driving Crown Victorias, and getting in and out of those vehicles with all of your equipment on. I can think of a couple officers who developed knee problems just from sitting down, twisting, getting up out of the vehicle and twisting quickly. Those types of things have unintended consequences. And so when you elevate the car, now you're in more of a lateral motion, and so maybe that has some positive impacts on officers' knees and ankles and how
Yeah.
they twist just getting in and out of the car as many times as you do throughout a shift. So building those things in where officers can just take advantage of them without even really thinking about it. Hopefully in 20 years' time, we'll see a positive impact from it.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you talked about the vehicle, and I think there's so many things that we don't think about. And I know you said unintended consequences. I think that's why it's really important for us to look at everything and ask ourselves, is this the most effective way? Is this the best way? Because I'm sure that there are people from your generation that are like, we got to change these cars.
Yeah.
Getting in and out is really difficult, but maybe didn't think that it was an option. And so to have those conversations of, is there a better way for us to XYZ, then we can start to see more of that forward progress. That's really interesting. I don't think I've ever had anyone talk about the vehicles before.
Yeah. And, one of the things that I hate hearing is we've always done it this way,
Mhm.
or I grew up this way, so you've got to experience it this way. And again, it's just incumbent upon leaders to look back at some of the negative experiences they've had throughout their career and change it for that newer generation.
Mm,
Uh, and again, sometimes it's unintended. Sometimes it's got an unintended good impact on our young officers.
yeah. Do you think, on the topic of leaders, do you think that leaders take care of themselves as much as maybe they could or should? And do you think that it's important for leadership to focus on their own wellness to set an example?
Absolutely. I don't think we do a good job of taking care of ourselves. We often have conversations and focus on officer wellness from a staff perspective. And those are important, but we can't forget about ourselves. Also, oftentimes, even in the police academy or when you're going through the FTO program, your instructors will tell you if you don't arrive safely, you can't help anybody.
Hmm.
And the same thing applies in a leadership role or a police executive role. You've got to take care of yourself. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very difficult to take care of your department, your officers, your civilian staff. And we're not good at that. Quite often we'll overlook our own mental health, our own physical well-being, because you just get so deep in the amount of work that has to be done. You have stressors and responsibilities to your elected officials, to your city manager, to your lateral departments around the agency, and then you've got responsibilities to the internal side of the agency as well. And then you've got your community that you've got responsibility for. So all of those things push and pull. And somehow we have to be able to, I hate the word balance, but sometimes we have to find that balance to be able to, um, you know, carve out time for ourselves. Because it's very easy to lose yourself in these jobs. We do it when we're 20 years old and we're just starting out as an officer, and 30 years later, you're still doing it, just in a different way. So finding that ability to build some time in to take care of yourself mentally, physically, pays off dividends, across the board.
I would imagine that we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about the word balance, and I think that you and I would probably align a lot on that topic. There's a girl that I follow. They're actually a couple. They're called the Hermosies. Have you heard of them? The Hermosies, like
I have
Alex
not.
Hermosi, Layla Hermosi. I love their story. Kind of like rags to riches a little bit in like their business world. They come from a fitness background, and um, the husband will say all the time that the wife is why they're successful, even though he's like the one that's like more well known, and he's like, she's really the genius behind everything that's happened. And so I watch a lot of her content, and she talks about this. She talks about being the leader of a company or an organization, and how if she is burnt out and she is like in the grind constantly and can't like take a step back, she's doing a disservice to the people that work with her because she can't be an effective leader. She doesn't have the opportunity to show up in the way that they deserve. And so she talks about strategies on, how you can, she talks a lot, of course, she's in a different space, but she talks a lot about delegation. She talks a lot about prioritization of tasks. Is it a high level task or a low level task? And she has like her team like only give her high level, and then all the other things I can kind of sort out later. But I really like it because it's like, how can you, one, create more space for yourself to be able to make those effective decisions, to be able to zoom out and see the bigger picture. But you also need to be able to prioritize yourself and your capacity for things because there's always going to be more things. There's always going to be another task. There's always going to be another email. There's always going to be another something for you to do. And I think that we have to recognize that. And I used to be really bad about this too. Um, I used to be very bad at this. And I had to just tell myself it is a non-negotiable. On these days, these times, I am going to go to the gym or I am going to do these things, non-negotiable. Because there's always, if I left that open, it would be completely filled every single day for the unforeseeable future, you know?
Yeah. And I kind of equate that. I've got a rule for myself. It's called the
Okay.
coffee cup rule.
Okay.
And if it's an issue that's going to cause me to put my coffee cup down and go handle, I need to handle it. That's my litmus test.
Mm.
If it's something that I can continue and finish my cup of coffee in the morning or, whenever it is, it's probably not that important and it can rest for a minute. That kind of couples with another saying that kind of rattles around in my mind quite often is sometimes you just have to let the situation develop to get a better understanding of what is happening.
Mm.
So that knee-jerk reaction that I have to respond to this email, I have to respond to this text right now, can be tested by those two things in my mind um, quite often. And I think that's a good way to allow ourselves to carve out that time for
Mhm.
ourselves. Like you said, is it time to go to the gym? Yes. Um, this email just came in. Can I finish my cup of coffee first, or does it need an immediate response?
Yeah.
I can finish it, or I can go hit the gym. Yeah. So
Yeah.
finding something that works for yourself as a test to those questions, I think, is very beneficial, both young and older in your career. So
I really like that a lot, actually. I'm gonna start using that. Can I finish my coffee or do I gotta set this cup down right now? I think
yeah.
that's great. And then for me, for everything in between, like I've just been realistic with my schedule and trying to understand like when do I have time outside of my career to do these things. And last year looked very different from this year. Last year, the only time I could do things was at 5 o'clock in the morning. And so I got my butt up at, 4:30 o'clock alarm went off and I was in the gym with my trainer at, 5:15. And I did that for a long time because that was my time where I didn't have to worry about the emails. I didn't have to worry about the tasks. It was before, and obviously everyone has different schedules, but there's a commitment that's required to carve time outside of what you do, and to add extra time to your schedule. Now I do it after. And I never used to be an evening person, but it's been working well for me this year of going and scheduling time, and I go in at 5 o'clock. So I think we have to allow ourselves to change with the seasons of our life too, and understand that sometimes maybe you have the capacity to like get up early and do these things, and sometimes you don't, and you gotta like carve out other time, to do these things. But we all have the time. It's
Right.
challenging, but we do all have the time. And I've been having to be really intentional because that's the number one pushback we're always going to get is like, well, I don't have time. So having your test or coffee test throughout the day of like how to carve out that time and be effective with the time is great. But then outside of work, how are we spending our time? Are we scrolling through Instagram? Are we watching 4 hours of Netflix at night? Not to say don't do those things. Sometimes it feels good to like watch a movie with your partner or whatever that looks like. But could we be using some of our time more effectively? Could we maybe be watching that TV show while we're meal prepping? Habit stacking. Could we be working out and maybe on the treadmill while we're scrolling on Instagram? Can we
Yep.
can we figure out ways to be more effective? And so I think it just starts with having those honest conversations with ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And finding out what your priorities are. If
Mhm.
you write them down and keep them somewhere close at hand, that will be helpful too. Something to remember or reference to, just so that you don't fall off track. Because it's
Mm,
in today's world, it's too easy
mm.
to fall off track with your priorities.
I like that. Yeah, like what is the why? Why are
Right?
you doing it? Yeah, I like that a lot. How do you think that, because we talk a lot about internal, how do you think that this career impacts home life and
Oh
family?
gosh. We could do a whole nother episode on that, probably a whole nother series, but I really think it impacts your spouse or significant other very differently than it may impact your children. And that is even more different than it may impact your extended family, your parents, brothers and sisters and cousins. Um, for me, I found that it impacted my children in more of a traditional way in the sense that talking to them now, they'll remember certain things like dad was gone a lot. He missed Christmases, he missed this birthday, or he missed this sporting event. But on the flip side, they remember that there was a time where I was working night shift patrol, and my office was rather small, and I always had a pack of gum on my desk. And they would come in and visit on the weekends or in the evenings when I was at work, and they remember that pack of gum because they would always steal a piece of gum or whatever from it, and they remember the smell of the office as well. So there's there's things that they miss, but there's also things that they experienced that their friends, didn't experience. My one son, my youngest son, has a very distinct memory of coming to work with me, going into the locker room while I was putting my uniform on, and him and his brother were just kind of running around, having a good time in the locker room and meeting the other officers, and just thinking it was so cool. Like
Mhm.
I'm in a locker room with police officers. That was just the highlight of the day for them. Um, so they have those core memories that are very different than other children may, but they also missed out on some things. For my wife, I think, and I don't want to get too emotional here, but she worried quite a bit. I mentioned that I had my own, mental health journey, and there were some things that really stuck with me that, quite honestly, I didn't deal with. I just put them in a box and left them alone. And she saw that, from the outside looking in, it was clear as day. And so that was very stressful for her. And how do we, for her, it was how do I bring this up? How do I approach this? And point out some of these issues that I see. And so, I think it's very impactful for the family. My wife spent 10 years in law enforcement, so it wasn't necessarily the kind of that stereotypical of I don't know what's going on at work for him. Like, is he safe? What kind of calls is he going on? She had very firsthand information on that. So that piece wasn't very stressful for her. It was the aftermath, the years that I went through a time where she could just see how all of the internal and external stresses really impacted myself, impacted our relationship. And so every family has to deal with it differently. My recommendation is you deal with it up front. You've got to be open and you've got to talk about these things. And that was one of my motivators to start talking about my, mental health and how do you deal with this type of stuff to my kids, knowing that they want to go into this career. Because I don't want them to bury this for 15 years and have to deal with it. I want them upfront, processing some of the things that they see, do, feel early on in their career so that, it can be as productive and fruitful as possible for them.
Yeah, and you had mentioned this earlier that you wanted to have these conversations be a normal part of your home life with your
Yeah.
kids and with your spouse. Do you think that agencies could do a better job of maybe providing training or resources or, helping to make that an easier part of, the day to day? Because it's not always easy for someone to go and talk themselves. Do you think that there's anything that can be done more for the families to maybe facilitate those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen that a little bit throughout the nation where there's certain training programs or presentations that speakers will give where the families are invited.
Mm,
And there's that back and forth between what the officer or first responder may be feeling and how that is impacting their family or vice versa. Those things are brought up. So I think the toe is being dipped in the water on that. However, we definitely need to do a better job because, everybody experiences this, but it's hard, for me to kind of wrap my head around how would we effectively, train families or expose families to some of these things is very hard because everybody deals with it differently. Everybody has different experiences. And, you know, how do you explain to a 3-year-old what mom or dad may have, experienced on a previous shift or why they may not be feeling so hot right now to how do you explain that to a 17-year-old? So there's very big differences and there's a wide spectrum there that departments need to consider. Um, and quite frankly, law enforcement is not perfectly geared for that. You have to reach out and talk to the professionals on how to build a program around that. And whether, agencies approach it individually or maybe from a regional standpoint, would be something to consider.
yeah. Yeah. And I agree with you. I think it's a conversation that's starting to kind of bubble to the surface and it wasn't really touched on the last few years, but I think it's now starting to become more a part of the core conversation of, what does wellness look like? And, home wellness is a piece of that. I've had some chiefs talking about like some small ideas and things that they've done that I thought were kind of cool jumping off points. And of course, I think everything can always evolve, but I had a few that said they started almost like, I mean, you could kind of call it almost like a peer support, like family network, where I think it was kind of a simple like Facebook group or, some sort of community group where they included all of the spouses together so that, at the very least, if someone has experienced that before of like, hey, how do I explain this to my 3-year-old? And there's someone in there that's like, yeah, like I've been there. I have teenagers now and I know like this is what we did, and having that like that connection to where families don't feel alone and can maybe have more of that open conversation amongst themselves. I know is something that some agencies are doing. I know other agencies are, doing mental health check-ins and they're bringing the families in, to be a part of that. So I'll be interested to see how that evolves over time and, what the impact looks like. Because I've also heard that some officers get real mad when you reach out to their spouses and
Yeah.
they're, so it'll be interesting to see, but I do think that they need support too. And so, whatever we can do, even if it's just having a conversation about it, I think is helpful. Um, we are going to run out of time, but I have two more questions for you. And one
Sure.
is about retirement. I know that, obviously you're closer to retirement than you are the beginning of your career. So, how can leaders, how can even younger officers prepare proactively for retirement? How can agencies help to prepare people for retirement? Because we know that one day it'll ultimately come and we want to make sure everybody is ready.
Number one is, we have to recognize that these jobs are finite. When you're 21 years old, 22 years old, and you're starting in this career, we all say it, 30 years flies by, and you look back and you wonder where all that time went. So knowing that the job is going to end at some point in time, it is perfectly okay and acceptable to allow this job to become a little bit of your character, who you are. We couldn't do this if it wasn't. We're not just going to work to make widgets. We are impacting our community and helping people in some of their darkest times. That being said, don't ever lose you know what what else makes you tick. Maybe you like to fish, maybe you love to run, you hike, travel, whatever those other passion projects that you have, don't lose those over your career. Don't throw yourself so deep into this law enforcement pond that you forget some of those other passions, because those are going to come back when it's time to retire. And then, just because you're retiring doesn't mean that you're done working. So, maybe there's something else that you've always wanted to try. Maybe you've wanted to teach for the longest time. Maybe you've wanted to, build something with your hands. Be a creator in some respect. And so, um, that can always be a second career for you. And so, retirement, definitely, you have to set yourself up financially and be smart about, looking towards what's on the other side of this. Um, but really, I think maintaining and, being involved with whatever your passion is outside of law enforcement is extremely important, because that's all going to come back and give you something to do. You can't just retire and do nothing.
Yeah.
That's probably the worst thing you can do, most unhealthy thing you can do. But remember what those passions are for sure, and I think that will help people
Yeah.
think about retirement. Yeah,
Do you know Chief Doug Shoemaker? Have you ever met him before?
I don't.
He's retired now, but he said something very similar, and it was that just because you retire doesn't mean that you lose the value of what you did in your career. And I think that a lot of people feel that way, like they feel like they've lost their purpose, or maybe they don't have value anymore. And it was this conversation of what you what you did was very valuable. And it doesn't mean that you lose that, but it's up to you to write the next chapter, and you have to be the one to write that. You have to write your next chapter. And, obviously, like you said, being proactive, what does that look like? And not waiting. I've talked to plenty really good people, like people I actually really like, but plenty of leaders who are like getting ready for retirement. I'm like, what are you going to do? And they're like, I don't know.
Yeah,
Like, no idea. Haven't
yeah.
even thought about it, And it's like, man, how do we start those conversations early so that, because everyone is thinking about retirement. There's that running joke that the only two people that know their exit date are inmates and cops, because like you're counting it
Yeah,
down,
yeah, it's
everyone
true.
knows they're retired. They're like, I can retire in, 385
Yep.
days and 5 hours and 16 minutes and 4 seconds. Like they know down to the T of like when that retirement is. And so if you're counting that down and you know that it's coming, then how can you better prepare for that? So I appreciate the advice.
And it's okay to not want to leave this career because you love it so much. I mean, that's where you ultimately want to be at the end of the career.
Hmm.
but it's also okay to be excited about what's next.
Yeah.
You can have both. In that sense, yeah.
Yeah, I agree. My final question, you've already given so many great words of wisdom, but for that younger generation, anything you want to leave with them, maybe some words of advice that you wish you would have known when you were earlier or younger?
Yeah, there's two things that come to mind. Number one, I think it's extremely important for us to not overlook the chronic stress that this job can build. It doesn't always have to be those acute situations, those kind of flash in the pan incidents that you may become involved in. It's the things that expand over time. You know, the shift work, the poor eating habits we develop, the sleep deprivation, and then just the long-term stressors that come with the job of you're running from call to call to call. You never really have a chance to sit down and enjoy your day sometimes. Those things all build. And so don't overlook those. Take care of them early in your career. The most important one, though, that is very near and dear to my heart, because I screwed this one up royally, is don't hide things from your significant other. For many years, I didn't share things with my wife, even though she had been a cop for 10 years. She knew what I was doing, but I didn't share them because I didn't want to stress her out more. I didn't want to share some of those dark stories with her. And I thought I was protecting her, and I learned the hard way I wasn't. The biggest thing I can tell you is they know. Your significant other knows. They know when you've had a bad day. They know when you're hiding something from them, and that's almost as stressful to them as the actual event is to you. And so share those things, open up, have those healthy conversations, because that's, for lack of a better term, that's where the healing really helps. And, being able to get a different perspective from someone that you absolutely trust and absolutely love is so beneficial. So those would be the two things I would leave for the younger generation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you coming on here and sharing your wisdom and talking a little bit about wellness with me today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.